Hi, it's Ed. I'm back again with a little bit more of a tutorial about how to set up your Logic work environment with preferences, templates, and project settings. So one of the first things I always notice is, as you can see, it's getting pretty messy. Like if you actually start adding a whole bunch of tabs and I click things out, this is this is my work area in here. It's just ridiculous, really. So try and get into the habit of like popping out a whole bunch of these kind of windows. I tend to not even try and use these things at the bottom. Like you can see, you've got a piano roll, score window, and you've got a bunch of other stuff. And also you can do the mixer down here as well. The only problem with that is it's fine if you just got like 2 or 3 tracks on here. You can see it's imposing on this kind of main window. So I would recommend that you just set these up as separate windows. So, and give yourself plenty of room in here. So okay, let's try and do that. So the first thing is, here's our library over on the left here, and the library is triggered by this little I guess it's a library card icon. Does anyone even use those anymore? It's like the floppy disk for save, you know. It's a bit of a relic. This section here is the inspector. And you can see that's got the little I button up here for the inspector. Oh, by the way, all this can be customized up here. So this whole top bar, you can customize the control bar. I just right-clicked on it. Like, don't right-click on a button, right-click on a gap, and you can customize the control bar and display. I usually turn a few bits and pieces on. We'll get into some of these soon. You can also, once you've selected all the menu items you like, you can save that as your default. So every time you go into a new project, you can go apply defaults and you'll get that same look. You can see it just comes up here directly if you right click as well. So if I go apply defaults, whatever I had saved would actually come up. So I'm just going to go in here. I usually have it so I've got a custom LCD with a whole bunch of extra stuff in it. It's just kind of handy. Oops. You can see that there. That's my my pitch bend in my keyboard is actually getting a little bit wobbly and it's putting out some noise. So anyway, you can have all sorts of stuff in there. It really just is limited by the amount of space on your screen resolution. So maybe don't go too crazy. So I'm just going to save that as my default. You also have like an extra little bar that you can drop down. So this little tray icon here drops a whole bunch of extra tools down. And same thing, you can right click and customize this toolbar as well. So it just depends what you want to use. There's a whole bunch of the stuff that you may never use, so it's a bit pointless to actually kind of have it turned on. I'm just going to give myself some extra room. And yeah, that looks a little bit tidier. It's same thing. You can save this as part of your template. I'm just going to save as defaults. You might remember from my last tutorial, I went into the preferences, general, editing, so it was in the editing tab, and I turned on my right mouse button as assignable to a tool, and that means that I now have 3 tools showing up here. If I get rid of that, see, this is the normal default. There's only 2 tools in there. I prefer to always have a tool assigned to my right mouse and a tool assigned to my left mouse. And I've got a good argument that sort of says the pointer is the most handy tool, and you know, you'll use it for 90% of what you have to do. The marquee tool is like another 9% of what I use, and then this is really just for whatever else. And by the way, this middle one is what happens when you hold down the command key. You can see if you hold the mouse over it, gives you a good brief of what each thing does. Left click, right click, and command click. And there's a bunch of other ones as well. So if I hold down option, I get like the magnifying glass. So there's a whole bunch of things that are available straight away just by clicking one extra keyboard button. So I've got 3 tools there. I would go pointer, pencil, and marquee. The marquee is like, if you've ever used Pro Tools, it is like the selector tool. So if you right click and drag, you can use it to select an area, and it comes in really handy for editing and stuff. So rather than using the scissors tool to cut things, you can actually just drag that and click on it and it will cut. So it's way quicker. You don't have to change tools. It takes a split second. what I'm going to do is tweak up this particular Logic project, and I'm going to save it as a template so I can use it later with all my selections in it. Okay, so maybe the first thing we should do is I'm going to go through exactly the same sort of process as I showed you in the preferences and going to set those, but this time we're going to go look at project settings, and these are particular for each document or each project that you create in Logic. So you can have some of these that are specialized for doing film soundtrack, or you might have one for live band recording, and you might have one for doing MIDI based recording or dance music. So these things tend to be stuff that you would change depending on what you're actually doing. So I'm going to go project settings, general. It comes up with a little window here, and same thing, there's a bunch of tabs. Some of these look the same as in the preferences, but they're not quite the same. So the first thing is, let's just go through these because some of these are quite fundamentally different. So the project type means this. Use musical grid means that your primary way of working in Logic is using bars and beats. If I untick this, it turns to time. So if you're doing a film soundtrack, you would untick that generally, and now you're actually just working in time. Or if you're just recording a band without a click track, away you go. You'll notice it starts from 1 hour, which is really annoying. So I'm just going to show you how to fix that. If you are, in fact, let's turn that back on. What you can do is, just on a related note here, if you go to your little view option, you can view secondary ruler, and that will give you both rulers. And whichever one is your main one, swaps. So now we're in time, that's our main grid, and it just gives you some bars at the top. And now we're in bars, and it gives you the time at the top. Now, if you go into synchronization, a tricky little trick is you just tick that enable separate SMPTE view offset. SMPTE just means time code, so it's time. If you click that, what it's really doing is it's getting rid of the hour at the beginning. So up here, it's not showing 1 hour and 5 seconds. It's actually just 5 seconds, which is a lot easier to decode when you're looking at it. It's kind of handy to get an idea of how long your song is if you're doing song-based stuff. So just flicking back again, so musical grid, only load plugins needed for project playback. This is new in Logic 10.4.7. And what it really does is it just means if you have a track and it's got some plugins on it or an instrument and nothing is actually using that track, when you open it up each time, those plugins will be disabled and not taking any power away from your session. The moment you kind of click on that track or you do anything to it or try and record on it, all those plugins will become enabled. So it's helping kind of turn off stuff that you're not actually using effectively. Down here, there's a couple of little things. Automation. You can have region-based automation, which is kind of like MIDI, or track-based automation for turning up volume and pan and all that kind of stuff. And you can just sort of say which of those two will take automation if they're like fighting each other. So as you can see there, it says when selected, suspend track automation for regions containing automation for the same parameter. So it will only use one or the other. If you've got volume programmed in as a MIDI thing on a region and you've got a track volume, it will just say which one actually does the biz and which one gets ignored. Blah, blah, blah. This thing here, use preset parameter value for regions with that region automation. I usually just leave that unticked because you never know. It's like the preset parameter value can change depending on what you dial up on the preset. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that too much. Back to synchronization. Just remember I sort of tick this. Hey, by the way, just a little thing about this separate SMPTE view offset. It's also kind of handy if you're let's say you've got a 2-bar counter in before your song starts, so your song really starts on bar 3. I can just click that up, and now my 0 up on this ruler starts at bar 3. So it's a good way of kind of getting ignoring stuff before your song starts to get a better indication of how long your song actually is. And here as well, synchronization. This is where you can do all sorts of cool and funky stuff. It's a little bit more advanced. It's basically your synchronization modes. If you're synchronizing Logic with another application or another computer or some MIDI hardware. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here now. I'm not going to get into it too much. But you can see you can have like different MIDI settings for up to like 16 different MIDI ports, depending what you got plugged in out in the real world. So yeah, this is really just synchronization. Don't worry about that. The Uniter is basically a specialized MIDI interface that you used to be able to get for Logic. You hardly see them in the real world anymore, but they've got a whole bunch of cool features, so it gives you settings for it. Going into Metronome, this is basically just where you can set, do you want the metronome when you're playing, or just recording, or just during the count-in while you're recording, for example. So if you've got drums that you're playing to, you don't need it to click all the way through. This stuff here actually shows up on some of these options up on the toolbar at the top here. So this is really just if you want to go in there and get a little bit more detail, or tweak up some stuff for it. Smart Tempo is a pretty recent feature that was added to Logic. I think it was like version 10.4 or something. And so this is a handy thing for if you're bringing in audio files from another project. You can have it so that Logic can actually track the tempo within those files and create a tempo map and do some cool stuff like that. So I would say, unless you know what you're doing, and we might look at this in a future project, is just keep it on, keep project tempo. Otherwise, weird things can happen. So I won't worry about the details of this too much for now, but let's just leave that on keep project tempo. Hey, and by the way, it shows up here, so this is the same option up in the toolbar. So keep project tempo. Recording, there's a couple of things in here. So there's a recording menu in Logic itself, but here's some sort of default settings that you can change for this project. You can say how long your count-in is. So if I hit R for record, it will jump back 1 bar and it will give me a count-in of 1 bar before it starts recording. Or you can do it 2 bars. And you can see you can actually even do individual notes if you need to. Really handy for doing things with quite complicated, I guess, rhythmic structures or time values. You know, sometimes you've got to, like, if you've got a 4/4 section and the 3/4 section and you're trying to drop in for the 3/4 section, you know, it can get a little bit crazy unless you can manually set how many beats you get before it goes in. Anywho, I just leave it on 1 bar. Auto Colorized Takes is actually kind of handy. That does that same thing as I've talked about in the preferences when you are bringing files in. You know, you can have it so it auto colorizes them. In this case, it does it with takes. So if you're doing a take folder and going round and round in a circle, around in a cycle here, and it's actually creating takes, you can have each take a slightly different color. It just makes it easier to figure out which is a good one. You go, it's that green one, rather than take 32. Although, you know, maybe it's green take 32. I don't know. Depends how your brain works. Yeah, there's a bunch of other things here that are good to know about, but quite deep. It's just like auto demix by channel. This is what you would actually tick if you had a couple of you on MIDI keyboards trying to play different instruments in Logic at the same time. And you just set each keyboard that you're playing to a different MIDI channel, and it will get decoded, demixed as it comes through. Audio recording path, just leave that blank, because that will just be wherever your project is. It'll just create an audio folder within the project, and away you go. So if you actually set this manually, all your audio will be recorded in the same place. Now, there are times when that's handy. If you're working on a film soundtrack and you've got a bunch of other people all working on that project at the same time, you might have a central location for all of your audio. So that's why they kind of give you that option to have it elsewhere if you want. But generally speaking, don't touch it. Just going into tuning, this is basically just your master tune. Just be aware that this only really affects Logic's built-in instruments. So if you're using third-party ones like Native Instruments or some other synths, you know, if you tune this, they won't follow it. You have to go and actually do the same tuning within those instruments. So just be a little bit wary of that. But it can be kind of handy if you just are recording an out-of-tune piano or something and you need to kind of match with it. A lot of people don't know this about Logic, that it has some really weird instrument scales in here, and equal tempered is what we use. You know, it's a general intonation system or that we use. But if you go fixed, check out some of this list of different tuning systems there is. There's some really, really weird ones. If you want to mess with someone's head, go and change their tuning system to one of these. No, maybe don't. And also, by the way, this is a little of an interesting thing down here as well. The Whoo Mode tuning is basically where, because we use equal tempered, there's certain notes of a chord which don't actually sit perfectly in tune, and you can see like the third or the fifth. They're not perfect. And so what this Whoo Mode tuner can do is it can force, when you play a chord, it will actually analyze a chord and go, that's a third or that's a fifth, and it will actually do a very, very slight pitch correction on it and make it all harmonically in tune. So there's different modes there. Look it up on the internet if you want to know more about it. It's like super, super deep. And a little bit of a flavor at the moment is some of these kind of micro tuning systems. Anyway, one of the things I found out is also this doesn't do it for third-party instruments, so it can sound really ugly if you're actually using a combination of Logic stuff and other stuff. Moving along, this is our audio setups here, and what you can see is this is basically where you can set your sample rate for your project. You can also, if you're doing surround sound, you can set what sort of format. This here is basically just how your mixer works. I would say leave it on -3 or -3 dB compensated, and never ever tick this. Just believe me on this. If you tick that, it will cause all sorts of problems. Channel strips, just leave those on automatic. It's got some MIDI stuff here. You can pretty much leave all the stuff as is. I would say input filter, you might want to turn certain things off that are being generated by your MIDI keyboard or whatever, but it's pretty much can just stay like that. Chase can be kind of handy. You can see the default is to chase all these things. Chase is that thing where if you start playing halfway through a section and it's got let's say it's got a sustain pedal, it will actually scoot back down and look earlier and see if it should be playing sustain pedal now. So it's basically looking backwards down your region, and that's basically what chase does. So it's basically what do you want to chase within that region when you play it. By default, notes is turned off, but if you want to hear your notes instantly from when you hit play, I would tick that as well. So yeah. Clip length. This is it's sort of it's very simple and kind of tricky at the same time. It just means at the end of a MIDI region, do you want any of these things to happen? Do you want the channel pressure to be set to 0? Do you want the pitch bend to be put back to the middle? Do you want modulation to be set to 0 again? So any of these, you can basically have it so it resets it. And these are kind of like the defaults. I prefer to have these selected, but it could mess with people if you didn't know it was actually doing it. It can muck you up a little bit. Score, as you can see, this is a whole thing in itself. I could seriously spend like an hour just going through this. You can actually do guitar chords. You can do grids. You can do all sorts of stuff. It's like super powerful. Back in the days before Logic, it was actually another. The creators were from another program called Notator, and it was one of the better notation programs around, MIDI notation programs. And so that's still kind of in Logic. It's become a little bit clunky compared to a lot of other ones that have come out since then, but there's some die-hard users of it, and it is pretty powerful. So it's worth probably exploring some tutorials about that if you're really into doing the score notation based writing and editing. This is just some stuff about the movie. So if the movie's got its own soundtrack, you can actually kind of blend that in so you can hear it. You can offset it if you need to. This other last thing here, the assets, is basically what do you want to do? How do you want to handle all the file assets for this particular project? Generally speaking, you're almost always going to want to copy the audio files into the project. So whatever audio you bring in, there's a copy kept within the project folder. So if you give it to someone else or you back it up, you know that your audio is going with it. So I would say at least that. Convert audio file sample rate, I've ticked that as well. It just means if it's a different sample rate, when you bring it in, it will convert it. If you don't do that, it will bring it in, it'll be at the wrong speed. Don't do this one. Alchemy audio data is just your own custom stuff, so you can leave that tick. So it's pretty much just those that I would say. And at the moment, if I just get out of there without saving, I'm going to lose all those settings because they're saved as part of this project. So I'm just going to save it. If I want to keep all these things as a generic tool or template, you can just go save as template, give it a name. So, and you can see I've got a bunch of different ones. I've got some specialized ones. So I'm just going to go. I'll just leave it as Z test for the moment. And yeah, and so that's the guts of it. So now it's saved all of these settings, and that's probably enough for the moment. I'll give you some more blurb on how to use the rulers and tools in the next tutorial.